All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking some seriously fascinating theological metaphors and eschatological imagery found within Surah Al-Hajj, specifically focusing on verses 11 through 22. We're going to base our whole journey today strictly on the insights from an enlightening commentary into the light of the Holy Quran. This text offers a profoundly psychological, almost structural look at how human belief actually works, and I am so excited to share how it breaks everything down.
You know, what's really wild to me is how seamlessly ancient scripture taps into timeless human psychology. Right out of the gate, it asks this incredibly relatable question: are our beliefs merely conditional? Like, do we only believe when things are going perfectly for us? The text we're examining tackles this head-on, looking at what actually happens to human conviction when the inevitable storms of life hit.
To navigate all of this, we'll follow a pretty clear arc today. First, we'll look at the edge of faith. Second, despair and divine guidance. Third, 6 paths, 1 judgment. Fourth, 2 kinds of prostration. And finally, we'll wrap up with the final outcomes.
Okay, Section 1, the edge of faith. Let's see how the commentary builds a psychological profile of what you might call the fair-weather believer.
Verse 11 introduces a personality type we've probably all encountered, or maybe even been at some point. It's the person whose faith is, well, entirely seasonal. They worship only by tongue. For them, religion is basically just a transaction for material prosperity. If their wealth goes up or they're perfectly healthy, they're like, yep, this belief system is totally legitimate. But the absolute second a trial hits, sickness, financial loss, a bad break, they turn their face back to disbelief. They essentially blame the religion itself for their own misfortune.
The commentary nails this fragile state of mind using a very specific Arabic word from the verse, harf. It literally translates to the verge, or the extreme edge of a mountain. Picture that for a second. It paints a really vivid, precarious picture. Instead of being safely grounded in the center of their belief system, these individuals are standing right on the precipice. And because they're lingering on the edge, even a slight shake, a minor trial, or just a gust of wind can easily knock them off their path and out of the faith completely.
So we can naturally contrast this edge dweller with what we'd call the rooted believer. The fair weather folks, they're leaning on useless crutches, whether that's wealth, social status, or literal idols. And ultimately, they lose out on both this world and the hereafter. But the rooted believer, their firm conviction is actively combined with action. They're the ones the text says are rewarded with gardens beneath which rivers flow. The storms come, and they simply aren't moved.
Moving right along to Section 2, despair and divine guidance. Let's examine the psychological breaking point for those who lack that rooted faith when extreme hardship strikes.
Verse 15 uses a metaphor that is just, honestly, it's quite shocking. It talks about stretching up a rope to heaven. The text gives us 2 really fascinating ways to read this. The first is highly literal. Out of sheer, impatient wrath that God seemingly isn't stepping in to help, a person might make a mad, irrational decision, like literally stretching a rope to the ceiling to hang themselves. The second interpretation is metaphorical. They reach up to the sky to try and forcefully sever divine help from the prophet. The psychological truth here is profound, isn't it? When people lack a baseline of trust, they resort to restless, destructive behaviors that absolutely fail to quench their underlying anger or fix their problems. All right, Section 3, 6 paths, 1 judgment. Having looked at the individual psyche, the text now pans out to a macro view of world religions.
Verse 17 lists out 6 distinct groups representing different historical paths. And what's super interesting here is how the commentary points out they're actually arranged by their varying degrees of deviation from pure monotheism. It starts with the Jews, who had the least practical deviation, followed by the Sabians, then Christians, then the Magians, and finally ending with the utmost deviation, the polytheists, or those who associate others with Allah.
Just to clarify a couple of the lesser-known historical groups on that list, the Magians were ancient followers of a lost book, specifically Zoroaster. They believed in dual origins, basically a battle between light and darkness, or good and evil, and they deeply revered fire. The Sabians, on the other hand, were a moderate group sitting somewhat between Judaism and Christianity. They were known for living by streams and placing a massive religious importance on water.
So, why list all these historical groups? Well, it's a bit of a reality check. We really shouldn't expect earthly religious debates to ever truly end in this world. Human obstinance and blind imitation are just too strong a barrier. Instead, the text tells us the ultimate arbitrator is going to be Allah on the day of decision. That's the day when truth and falsehood are finally definitively separated, and all those historical discords are settled for good.
Which brings us to Section 4, 2 kinds of prostration.
This introduces a truly mind-bending concept about universal submission.
Verse 18 stretches the whole idea of worship way, way beyond just us humans. It asks the reader to look around and realize that literally everything in the heavens and the earth, the sun, the moon, the stars, the mountains, the trees, the animals, they are all in a state of prostration. It is this breathtaking cosmic view of existence where absolutely nothing operates outside of a grand, deliberate design.
The commentary breaks this down into a brilliant two-part philosophical distinction. First, you have genetic prostration. This is the unconditional, hardwired submission of the physical world. The atoms in your body, the cells in a leaf, the orbit of a planet, they all perfectly obey the genetic laws of creation. Think about this. Even a tyrant's physical body, down to the very beating of their heart, is in genetic prostration. The second kind is religious prostration. This is the willful, arbitrary submission performed by beings with intellect and free will, like humans and angels. So while all of nature is locked into genetic prostration, only some humans actually choose to perform religious prostration.
And that leads us to our last part, Section 5, the final outcomes. Here, things take a very intense turn as the explainer shifts to the afterlife. Because at the end of the day, all that complex religious diversity and human conflict we just talked about, it ultimately boils down to two opposing camps, believers and disbelievers. At its absolute core, their entire dispute revolves around a single foundational concept, the nature of their Lord. This core question of monotheism is the root of all the theological adversaries mentioned in the text. Verses 19 through 21 don't hold back. They describe some chilling consequences for those who knowingly and intelligently deny the truth. I mean, the visual metaphors are intense. They talk about tailored garments of fire, cut specifically for them, implying a punishment that surrounds them completely. It describes blazing, boiling water that penetrates so deeply it melts them from the inside out, alongside being beaten with maces of iron. It's a visceral, terrifying representation of absolute physical and spiritual chastisement. And then, verse 22 outlines this deeply unsettling, cyclical punishment. Picture this: the inhabitants attempt to flee the fire out of immense anguish and grief. But just as they reach the edge, they're heavily struck and forced right back down to the bottom to taste the burning all over again. There's a profound psychological layer to this. The sheer anguish of constantly hoping for escape, only to be defeated again and again, is described as a punishment even worse than the physical fire itself. It is a perpetual, inescapable loop of despair.
So we've journeyed all the way from the fragile psychology of that edge dweller, right through the vastness of cosmic prostration, all the way to the absolute finality of the day of decision. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought to chew on. When life's unavoidable storms inevitably hit your world, do you stand firmly in the center of your beliefs, or are you standing dangerously on the edge?